Overcast, and what we're really all confronting as whether you're a labor movement activist, whether you're in the policy realm, whether you're in the scholarship realm, are we in a transformative moment? Is this a flash in the pan? Where exactly are we as we head into 2024? And I do think, once again, a huge case and study is going to be these UAW campaigns in terms of examining the relationship between strikes by unionized workers and creating a more sustainable moment, a more transformation in the labor movement more broadly, and to see if the UAW is really going to be able to go out and organize these non-union plants that they've had such a difficulty organizing for so long.
Hello, powerful people, and welcome back to the Power at Work blog. My name is Seth Harris. I'm a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change, and I'm really excited to have you here for this very special, exclusive blogcast in which we welcome back an old friend of the blog and we talk about worker collective action, worker power, and strikes. My guest today is Johnnie Kallas, the founder of the Labor Action Tracker, and we'll be talking about the strikes and other labor protests that happened in 2023 all across America. The Labor Action Tracker is right now, just now, within the last couple of hours, issuing its annual report for 2023, and it's a real privilege that we get to have this exclusive interview with Johnnie Kallas to talk about that report and its contents, its results, and also to get him to give his analysis of those results. And let me also say, we make some news in this blogcast. There is some exclusive content that you will not find in any other news story. You will not find it in the annual report for the Labor Action Tracker. It's only here on the Power at Work blog. So listen for that very closely in this blogcast. But before we get to our interview, you should know that the Power at Work blog is a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Connects over 100 radio shows and podcasts. To learn more about the network or to find other labor radio shows and podcasts, visit www.laborradionetwork.org. And if you want to listen to or download any or all of the Power at Work blogcasts, they're available for streaming and download on Spotify, Apple, Overcast, all the commercial providers. Just go to your preferred commercial podcast provider and search Power at Work. You'll find us. We're there. And do us a favor, will you? While you're there, give us a 5-star rating. That's not just a favor to us. It helps other people to find this terrific content. And if you have friends who care about workers, if you have union siblings, I should say, who care about unions and their own future, tell them about the Power at Work blog podcasts on their favorite commercial podcast providers. All right. There was a lot of talk that 2023 was the year of the strike. And so we'll be talking to the man who has the numbers, who can tell us if those numbers back up the talk or if they tell us that it was all just talk. You're about to find out how many work stoppages and labor protests there were in 2023 and how that number compares to 2022 and 2021. Those numbers are produced by the Labor Action Tracker, which is a joint project now of my alma mater, Cornell University's School of Industrial Labor Relations, and the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois. But the man behind the Labor Action Tracker is Johnnie Kallas, and he's the one who's going to join us for today's discussion. Johnnie's worked in collective bargaining and organizing for the California Nurses Association and the Service Employees International Union. When he started the Labor Action Tracker back in 2020, he was a PhD student at the ILR School at Cornell, but I'm really delighted to say that Johnnie has finished his PhD and he earned a teaching appointment at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and they're immensely fortunate to have been able to get him. Our goal in this conversation is to help you to understand strikes and other collective actions and other work stoppages in 2023, what the report says about them. It cuts them in a lot of different ways with a lot of different kinds of data. And also, we're going to talk about why the results came out the way they came out. We're going to provide some unique, exclusive analysis and also some exclusive information and content and data that you can't get anywhere else. So with that, here is our exclusive interview with Johnnie Kallas of the Labor Action Tracker. Enjoy. Johnnie, let me start by saying it's great to have you back on the Power at Work blog, or should I say Dr. Kallas. It's great to have you on the blog for the first time in your new capacity as a PhD. Congratulations to you.
Great. It's great to be with you, Seth. I appreciate that. A long time coming.
Yeah, typical social science PhD program. It's like takes a generation, but it's great news. So, as you know, your 2023 Labor Action Report, annual report, is, I would say, hot off the presses, but nobody uses presses anymore. It's cold on the internet, I think is maybe the accurate way to say it now. So congratulations on that as well. Another terrific accomplishment for you and the team of people you work with at Cornell and at the University of Illinois. But you've also, in a way, this annual report, it's not anticlimactic, because having everything together in one place is a very, very valuable thing, and being able to look back over the whole year, I think, is a terrific thing. But you have been letting out data on a monthly basis, particularly on Twitter X, as we're calling it, I guess. And so people have been using the monthly data. I have used the monthly data in some of my TV appearances and in other places. So that's been really valuable. But nonetheless, you've got your third report out, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you about it, and in particular what it means for worker power and worker organizing and the state of the labor movement. But before we get into it, Johnnie, I want to share the headline numbers with our audience, and I'm going to give you a chance to clean up any mistakes I make. So there were, according to the Labor Action Tracker annual report, 470 strikes and lockouts in 2023. They used the umbrella term work stoppages. That was an 11% increase from 2022. But those 2023 work stoppages affected 539,000 workers, which was a whopping 141% increase from 2022. It's also worth noting that both the number of work stoppages and the number of workers affected had already increased from 2021 to 2022 by about 60%. So there, by any reasonable definition, I'm going to get you in on this in just a second, there's been epic growth in work stoppages and the number of workers involved over the last 3 years, although you were careful to note in the report that those numbers are far smaller than they were when the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, was reporting them in the 1970s. And I'm definitely going to want to ask you about that. The assessment you give in the annual report is that the work stoppage activity has returned to where it was in 2018 and 2019 rather than where it was in the 70s and 80s. So those 2023 strikes cost employers 24.9 million strike days in 2023. By comparison, employers lost only 4.4 million strike days in 2022 and 3.3 million in 2021. I remember when we talked last year, we thought the 2022 number was, oh my God, a one-third increase. Holy cow. That is the 2022 to 2023 increase, 566% increase. We're definitely going to want to talk about that as well. Your report notes that the dramatic growth in the number of workers involved in work stoppages is largely because of 4 gigantic strikes that viewers of the Power at Work blog and the people you do business with all the time are very well familiar with. And that is the UAW Big 3 strike, the SAG-AFTRA strike against the Hollywood studios, the Los Angeles School District strike, which was larger than people may be willing to admit, and the strike by the Coalition of Kaiser Permanente Unions. And just like in 2022, 1/3 of 2023's work stoppages were in the accommodations and food services sector, although there's a lot to talk about there, and I'm definitely going to ask you about this. 82% of those stoppages were connected either with the Starbucks organizing campaign or Fight for 15. So that is the 82% that's dedicated to those two actions is lower than it was in 2022, but still a very, very, very high number. But there was a lot of diversity in the industries that saw strikes, and I want to ask you about that. I won't take everybody through the numbers. I'll come back and talk about them in just a little bit. The percentage of all work stoppages in 2023 involving non-union workers, not union members, was lower than in 2022. But again, that's likely because you had these 4 gigantic union-led strikes. It wasn't that fewer non-union workers were striking. It's that the number of union workers striking went through the roof. A huge number are doing that. And just very quickly, as you found in 2022, the number 1 and number 2 demands that workers made when they went out on strike was, we want more pay and we want better health and safety. There's an interesting development that I'm going to want to ask you about, and that is that the third most common demand was increased staffing. And I want to get your take on why that happened. And then finally, just like in 2022, most work stoppages in 2023 were really quite short. Almost 2/3 lasted fewer than 5 days. Although again, 3 of the 4 very, very, very large strikes lasted much, sadly, with the exception of the coalition of Kaiser Permanente union strikes. The other 3 strikes lasted much, much, much too long. Or maybe exactly the right amount of time, because the contracts that came out were really, really good. Okay, so let's start with this. Are there any headline numbers that I didn't highlight that I should have?
So you certainly covered a lot of our main findings from 2023, Seth. There's 2 other headline numbers that I would point out to. One is that first contract strikes more than doubled from about 36 in 2022 to 74 in 2023. I don't think this is surprising considering the state of where the Starbucks union campaign is now, and either other organizing campaigns that are now turning into bargaining fights at Trader Joe's and other high-profile employers. But I do think it's important to note that because it's very much related to the status, or the state, I should say, of those organizing and bargaining campaigns. And the only other sort of big picture trend I'll really point to, and I think after 3 years it's safe to call this potentially a trend, is that the U.S. really sees very low level of a wildcat strike activity, at least in the past 3 years. So wildcat strikes, which we define in sort of a very U.S.-based institutional context as unauthorized strikes by union members in opposition to union leadership, accounted for less than 10% of all even unionized strikes in 2022 and 2023. And I just think this is a somewhat important finding because obviously the Red for Ed statewide educator strikes in 2018 and 19 that we'll come back to later were largely of this unauthorized or wildcat type. So it's not that they've completely disappeared, but they're very rare. And it's not necessarily saying that the rank and file and union leadership are totally in lock and step with each other. But outside of a particular context, which are sick outs by K through 12 public education and school bus drivers, wildcat strikes are almost non-existent. And I think it's an important trend that our data have uncovered over the past few years.
That's absolutely fascinating and something that I had not picked up on. That's really, really terrific. Okay, so let me just start big picture. So as you said, you're 3 years into this. You created this fantastic tool that really is an innovation. After all of these numbers and all of the analysis that you've done, and you're thinking about these issues and your own experience as a trade unionist, what should we think about strike activity, work stoppage activity, collective activity by workers in 2023? Because a lot of the rhetoric, including my own, was this is the biggest, this is the most consequential, this is, strike summer, labor summer, hot labor summer, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't just the summer, as it turned out. Give us sort of your overarching takeaway from all of these numbers.
I think it really depends in some ways what you're comparing these numbers to. And this sort of gets to a point you made earlier in terms of are we really, for example, in the middle of a strike wave um, or not? And like I said, if you're comparing it to, for example, data in the 1970s when approximately 5,000 work stoppages occurred a year involving 2 million workers, the numbers seem quite a bit lower. However, if you're comparing it to the rest of the 21st century, which I think is probably a more appropriate comparison, and especially the last couple of years, you have seen a noticeable increase in both the number of both the number of work stoppages and especially the number of workers involved in stoppages. So I don't mean to punt on the question. I think in a lot of ways it depends what you're comparing it to. What I will say is there is this overarching question, well, what does this mean for the labor movement? And can these strikes be translated? And this is really the question of our time heading into 2024 into more sustainable, not just bargaining, but organizing gains. And that's the question that hasn't really been answered. What is the relationship between strikes and unionization or organizing? The UAW is going to be such an important case in point this year, right? They're leveraging a really strategic and powerful strike victory at the Big Three last fall, where they won a fairly unprecedented contract. And now they're going out under a new militant leadership to try and organize various non-union car manufacturers across the United States. So I really think that question is still out there. I certainly think it's a noticeable and important uptick. But it's really hard to say definitively whether we're in a new moment sort of for the labor movement right now based on these numbers.
Well, that's beautiful foreshadowing because I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to predict what you think is going to happen in 2024, but I'm going to save that for the end. So stick around, everybody. So I want to talk about this comparison of what happened in 21, 22, 23, and what happened back in the 70s. How much of that is simply a function of the fact that in the 1970s, you had much, much higher union density. And so workers had more power. You also had more union members to go out on strike, but workers just had more power in more industries. Or is there something else that we need to understand about the comparison between 50 years ago and today?
I think it's a little bit of both. So I think many of the factors that led to union decline also led to strike decline, right? So you have sort of a transition from the manufacturing-based economy to a service-based economy to smaller workplaces. Obviously, employers became, for a variety of reasons, well, they've always been fairly anti-union in this country, but a lot more anti-union in the late 20th century. I think partially because of that, unions saw strikes as a last resort, and striking was often quite an ineffective last resort. I mean, there are numerous stories of manufacturing workers going on strike in the late 20th century for months, if not years, and frankly, losing strikes, losing their jobs, losing an incredible amount of pay. What I do think is different right now than maybe even what you saw in the 1970s is many of these strikes being waged today are very much offensive strikes. Workers are demanding more. They're not fighting concessions. They're not necessarily fighting back, takeaways. They're actually demanding better pay. They're demanding better health and safety. They're demanding a first contract. So I think the nature of these strikes have shifted considerably. And that I think is an important distinction with what happened in the late 20th century. So in some ways, I do think unions are beginning to reclaim the strike as a tool to secure advancements rather than as a last resort to defeat concessions. And I do think that's an important qualitative shift.
Yeah, I think that I agree with you that that is very important. I wanted to just note that the wide scale and high profile use of permanent strike replacements really essentially union busters who took the jobs of strikers who were functionally fired for striking, which is supposed to be illegal, but we all know is really not. That really began in the 1980s. There's an early case in labor history in the late 1930s where it occurred, but it really became a much more common corporate tactic in the 1980s, and that raised the cost of striking for workers beginning in the early 1980s, and that only got worse. As you were saying, in the 1990s, there were a lot of strikes, very important strikes, big industrial strikes that where the workers just ended up losing because they couldn't hold the line against the employer. So I want to agree with your analysis there. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about industries. Because the accommodations and food services sector and also the educational services sector were really prominent in 2022. But in 2023, you found that there was a broader dispersion of strikes among industries. Dispersion is the wrong word. More industries saw strikes than had seen them, at least in large numbers, that had seen that same kind of activity in 2022. That is a data point that could, I think, be easily misunderstood or misconstrued, or at least put to a lot of different theories or used as confirmation of a lot of different theories. What theory do you think that fact in 2023 supports?
I think what it supports is you have a lot more just union militancy spread across different sectors of the economy. So in terms of the number of strikes, as you pointed out, it's actually been relatively constant from last year to this year. About 1/3 of all strikes was organized in the accommodation and food service sector, overwhelmingly by Starbucks workers and fast food workers organizing with SEIU's fast food campaign now, largely in California, but also across the country. So I think there's some consistency there. In terms of the number of workers on strike, you absolutely have seen a serious shift from last year where 60% in 2022, of all workers on strike came from the educational services industry. This is similar to what you saw during the statewide Red for Ed strikes back in 2018 and 19, overwhelmingly, obviously, from the educational services industry. But now you see these large strikes rooted in the private sector, rooted in the same industries where unions have been weak for a very long period of time. And I think there's a number of factors. Some of it may be related to labor market conditions and the pandemic. You have healthcare workers, for example, at Kaiser, who have been part of a long heralded sort of intricate labor management partnership, who largely were fed up with stagnant wage growth and obviously staffing and health and safety concerns coming out of the pandemic, rightfully so for hospital workers on the front line, right? But you also have, for example, in manufacturing, UAW striking at not just one, but all three of the big three companies. And that, I think, is largely a result of a new sort of union leadership coming into play, implementing a sort of strategic, more militant strike tactic. And while you didn't see a strike, for example, at UPS, you saw a very credible strike threat similarly along those lines, largely, I think, because of the new leadership. So I think it's a combination of factors, whether it's labor market, COVID. I also think this increase in union activism, not just from members, but also now leaders, played a role in a more, I guess, like you said, dispersion of strike activity through multiple industries where unions, at least recently, haven't necessarily been very strong.
Well, so I want to not push back, but I want to sort of add a little bit more consideration to that question. I don't disagree with what you just said, but let me just throw another fact in and see what your reaction to it is. So when I saw that there were a lot of workers in the information sector who had gone out on strike, my reaction to that was, okay, well, that's SAG-AFTRA and that's the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And when I saw manufacturing, I said, okay, well, that was the UAW. And when I saw healthcare, I said, okay, well, that's the coalition of Kaiser Permanente unions. So, to some extent, because the numbers here, while seemingly very big, are actually pretty small, right? You have 500 some odd thousand workers out of a workforce of 160 million engaging in 470 some odd strikes. It's sort of small enough numbers that one big strike in one sector can suggest to us that, oh my goodness, something big is happening in that sector. Or am I getting that wrong? Am I overplaying the significance of those 4 or 5 really big, long-lasting strikes?
I think a really big difference between 2022 and 2023 were those 4 very big strikes. I mean, those strikes accounted for close to 2/3, I believe, of the number of workers on strike. And they largely drove these changes we saw in terms of sort of sector shifts with the number of workers on strike. So I absolutely think that you're onto something there. But these strikes sort of even out hit their own weight, even though they're quite large, right? So it's hard to tell right now what the impact of the UAW strike is going to be. Is the UAW strike going to lead to a more highly organized auto industry, which could pave the way for a more revitalized labor movement? That would mean that the UAW strike certainly reached more people than the 50,000 workers that already impacted, which is a huge number of workers to begin with. I should say, actually, the 150,000 workers that are covered by those big three contracts. Similarly, when you look at Hollywood, right? Hollywood really began the Hollywood strikes with 11,500 writers. I think a large reason 160,000 actors went on strike is because they saw 11,500 writers going on strike. So It's really hard to necessarily quantify the impact of these strikes. Look, if you want to take a real macro view and look at the total amount of workers on strike compared to the number of workers in the broader economy, yes, it is a fairly small number. But the question is, what will these strikes translate into? And that's still very much, I think, a question that's left outstanding.
Yeah, no question about it. In fact, I think we're going to get a sense of the effect of the SAG-AFTRA and Writers Guild strikes in Hollywood, because there are two negotiations that are going to happen in 2024 in Hollywood, right? You've got IATSE, and you've also got the musicians, who are actually, their deadline is first. I think their contract expires in May. So will the Hollywood studios behave differently with those two unions because of the experience that they had? My money is on no, but we're going to have to see sort of how it plays out. I think rich people can learn. They just may not do it in exactly the same way that you and I and your students do, or my students do. Okay. I don't even know what that means, but I got a kick out of it. Okay. So let me, I want to take that same question and sort of turn it a little bit sideways. So, again, because we're dealing with big numbers that are still fairly small numbers in the macro context, to some extent, the activity that we saw in 2023 was a consequence of when particular contracts expired, right? The UAW contracts expired in 2023. The ILWU contract expired in 2022, but the negotiations ran into 2023. The Hollywood contracts, the Teamsters contract, the other. So that in trying to figure out whether there are trends here, that is a factor that you kind of have to take into account. Am I overplaying that, or is some of this just a function of timing?
Some of it. I wouldn't say all of it. And once again, I apologize. I'm taking this, it's the new academic in me. I'm taking a lot of middle grounds. There's a lot of gray area. We have to really work our way through these numbers, right?
That's okay. We're good. We're good with gray here. We're good with gray on the Power Work blog.
You're absolutely right. Look, there were some huge bargaining units that had contracts expiring in 2023. And we'll get to this a little bit later, there are going to be some large bargaining units that have contracts expiring in 24. It certainly does not match the number of what we saw in 2023. So I think a large reason you saw a considerable increase in the number of workers on strike in 23 is because you had very large contract expirations that came due in that past year. And that's not even counting, once again, I mentioned 350,000 Teamsters at UPS are not reflected in these numbers, but they organized a very credible strike threat. And there's a lot of strike threats. Some are not as credible as others, and that's a part of the analysis we don't have, but it's important to take into account, right? That's 350,000 workers who won a fairly strong contract because of that strike threat that are not reflected in these numbers. I also, though, think, once again, at the UAW, I don't think without, like I've mentioned a couple of times, a change in leadership, or perhaps some of these other unions just taking a more activist or militant approach, you don't necessarily see these levels of strike activity. So just because there's a contract expiration, there's been a lot of contract expirations involving a lot of workers over the past 30 years. But 2023, I can easily say, is one of the top years, even though we don't have comprehensive data going back to 2000 for strike activity. So I think it's definitely a big part of the picture. I don't think it's the entire picture, though.
I think that's perfectly fair. You're right. There have been other years when there have been a lot of contracts expiring and they didn't result in strikes. Sometimes because the parties were able to get to a deal, sometimes because the unions were forced into concessions, sometimes because the leadership didn't think they could effectively lead a strike. There are a lot of reasons why that would have happened. That's a very important point, but I want to let me now take you to the next step of that analysis. You had these 4 large strikes. They sort of dominate the numbers here, or at least played a big role in the jump that we saw in the numbers with respect to the number of workers on strike and the number of strike days lost. Is there a story to be told about the other data, the 399 strikes that were below 1,000 workers? Is there something that you saw in the data that we can understand about some smaller is kind of a funny thing to say about 800 or 900 workers, but strikes that weren't huge strikes like the ones that we're talking about, the ones that are smaller, lower profile? Is there something that you can glean from the data about those?
I think it depends on the institutional context, really, of the strike in question. So some of those smaller strikes are very much similar to the large ones in that they involve unionized workers walking off the job in response to failed contract negotiations, right? But we mentioned the accommodation and food services sector earlier. Those strikes are fueled by workers who are very much either at the beginning of a grueling organizing and bargaining campaign at Starbucks, or are part of this innovative sort of now sectoral campaign at fast food in places like California and others across the country. So, and a lot of those strikes, workers are not necessarily trying to make an immediate sort of material gain in their working conditions. They're trying to voice their frustration and concern with what's going on, either in their union campaign or the industry more broadly. And those strikes sort of have a different kind of strategic significance. So I think it really depends on what exactly type of strike you're looking at. Some of them are unique in their own right. Look at what MTA is doing in Massachusetts, right? They've now organized multiple illegal district-wide school strikes. I mean, these are completely illegal in the state of Massachusetts. They're fined because of it, but they're still organizing these strikes. Newton ended up becoming the most prominent. Obviously, that's 2024. But for many of these strikes, they've actually secured pretty strong contracts. So I think each of these strikes has a little bit of a story to tell. I would think contextualize it in, are you looking at strikes like many of these were under 1,000 workers as part of traditional conventional contract negotiations, or are they part of a different union strategy like in the case of MTA where strikes are illegal, or are they part of a specific sort of campaign that really drove the number of strikes to be quite higher in 2022 and 2023, specifically Starbucks, but are certainly much different in nature and scope than what we saw from the UAW or SAG-AFTRA, etc.
You can stay up to date with the latest news about workers, worker power, and unions by subscribing to the Power at Work blog. You'll receive the weekly download, a Power at Work newsletter sent straight to your inbox. The weekly download collects about 24 of the week's articles, academic studies, press releases, podcasts, and videos from across the internet. We find the stories and deliver them directly to you. So subscribe to the weekly download right now on the front page of the Power at Work blog. Go to poweratwork.us.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, so this is a terrific opportunity for me to show how smart I am. So last year, when we spoke about your 2022 report, I asked you how much of the story that these numbers tell is a story of individual unions. And you very intelligently said, well, there are some unions that use the strike weapon more frequently than others. SEIU is a great example of that. The nurses, some of the state nurses associations are excellent examples of that. And now you've told me you actually have some data where you've analyzed the numbers by union. So tell us what you found.
Yeah, so this is special for the Power at Work blog. We have not included this as part of our annual report.
This is an exclusive.
This is an exclusive.
Power at Work blog exclusive. I love that.
Hey, you asked me about it. I had to compile some data. Yeah, so I just want to be clear, just in terms of the data, these are strikes that just began in 2023. There were about a dozen or so strikes that carried over. So there could be a couple misses here or there, but I think this really gives you a sense of the big picture. SEIU organized more strikes than any other union. If you do not include Workers United, SEIU organized 75 strikes beginning in 2023. I unfortunately don't at this point have data on the number of workers, which is an important variable. But in terms of the number of strikes, SEIU organized 75. If you include Workers United, that's an additional 88 strikes. This is largely driven by the Starbucks campaign. So SEIU, Workers United, is an affiliate of SEIU. That would take their total up to 163. The Teamsters organized the second most strikes in 2023. They organized 45 strikes. I thought in 2021 and 2022, we could go back and do these data collection. I have not. That SEIU and Teamsters seem like the top two, and that's certainly reflected in our number. The top five is rounded out by UFCW, organized 23 strikes that began in 2023. UAW organized 22 strikes. Once again, that's equating a strike potentially by a couple dozen workers with a strike at the big three by 50,000 workers. So just want to put that disclaimer. And then CWA organized 19 strikes. And I need to just add, Unite Here, we had organizing 17 strikes. They've been organizing a series still to this day of rolling strikes in Southern California. They were very challenging, and I can talk if you want about the methodological challenges. That might be best for another day, to be able to count all those strikes individually. We ended up, and I think the BLS did this as well, grouping those all together. So if Unite Here feels like they're being shorted here, it'd be great if we could get a clear understanding of exactly how many strikes have been organized in Southern California hotels. We do count that as one very large strike. So anyways, that rounds up your top six. I think your initial sort of thought about SEIU certainly is borne out by the data. And then you have Teamsters, UFCW, UAW organizing a lot of strikes as well.
Yeah, so let me just say what had not occurred to me when I asked you that question last year is that we may be setting off a competition, right? So you may get a call from D. Taylor at Unite Here saying, hey, wait a minute, you didn't count it. That's not fair. We should win. And here, okay, so I want to ask you about those strikes because you listed several unions that have workers who are in jobs where there are meaningful barriers to entry to those jobs. The UAW membership, you can't just walk in off the street and build a car. A lot of the CWA membership, you can't really walk in off the street and do the kind of technical work that they do. But you also mentioned, and SEIU is at the top of this list and at the top of your list, unions that are in jobs that represent workers who are in jobs where there have traditionally been low barriers to entry, right? There are not a lot of skills requirements. There are not a lot of experience requirements. There are not a credential or degree requirements. I hesitate. The phrase I'm staying away from is low skill work because I don't think there is such a thing. All of those workers have important skills, but they're skills that can be acquired on the job, many of them. You could say the same about some of the Unite Here folks. So I have been advancing the hypothesis over the course of the last year, trying to explain what's going on, is that the unions that have been successful in their strikes tend to be those where the jobs that the workers who are in the union do have higher barriers to entry. UAW, Teamsters, although I'll talk about the Teamsters in a second, writers, actors, or they have tremendous density in the industry. The Teamsters at UPS, the numbers were so huge. UPS could never have replaced 330,000 truck drivers. But there are other unions, like the baristas at Starbucks or the warehouse workers at Amazon, where replacing them would be a lot easier. Do these data support that hypothesis? Because that's a lot of strikes by a lot of workers who are at real risk of being replaced. It seems like maybe you're proving my hypothesis wrong, or at least offering evidence that I kind of got it wrong a little bit.
This is where it depends. How do you define what a strike is? Or I should really say not all strikes are the same, right? So the SEIU, well over 150 strikes. These are not all strikes like what you saw SAG-AFTRA or others wage, where they're, all-out war struggles until both sides reach an agreement. Many of these strikes are what I have called, and others, fixed duration strikes where workers are walking out for a predetermined amount of time. You see this in healthcare all the time, right? And then they'll return to work unconditionally at the conclusion of the strike. Similarly, a lot of Starbucks strikes are organized this way. So I don't think it necessarily proves your hypothesis wrong. I think it demonstrates the different kind of and diverse ways that unions are making use nowadays of the strike weapon. At times, it can be a way to build political or narrative power against the employer. The fast food Fight for 15 campaign has done this, I think, extremely well over the past decade. Starbucks workers are trying to, do this a little bit now today. So I think it really depends what kind of strikes you're looking at. So, I haven't divided these types of strikes by SEIU into how many really look like what the UAW did. I would guess that it's a relatively small percentage, not saying it doesn't happen. So I think you're right. I think whether you want to call it structural power or whatever term you want to use, plays a large role in whether workers can really win those all-out struggles and all-out fights of those indefinite work stoppages. But many strikes, what we see today, and this is reflected in the duration data set that you mentioned at the top, are relatively short, and they're used as a way to build broader political and even economic power, but over time, which I think is a lot different than the way we conventionally, think of strikes in the U.S. context.
Yeah, it shows a lot of creativity by the folks
Absolutely.
at SEIU and Workers United. Even those workers are replaceable. Targeted short strikes make headlines. They grab the attention of regulators. They grab the attention of workers in the area. They show that the union is willing to support workers who are under attack, and they can be effective even if they are not the same as a UAW strike where you're shutting down facilities until the employer caves in on your demands. I think that's a very, very, very important point. Okay, I want to talk about non-union workers, because as I said last year, I think you've done a real service by reminding people that non-union workers can strike and that they are legally permitted to do that. They are legally protected when they do that. And there's still a sizable percentage, about a little under a quarter in the 2023 data of the strikes were by non-union workers. Are you seeing any kind of trend developing with respect to strikes by non-union workers, or does it look very much like 2021 and 2022?
And I'll just start by answering this question by saying this is still our most surprising finding of our project since we began in 2021. I know that obviously in the private sector, 94% of workers are non-union, but I don't think people expected that at least for 2021 and 2022, 1/3 of all strikes would have been organized by non-union workers. And I understand it did decrease a little bit to about 22% in 2023. But to me, that's still, if you had asked me 3 years ago, would have been a relatively, or at least a higher number than I would have anticipated. So I just want to start by that. I think the trends are relatively similar in terms of what these non-union strikes look like. To me, they're largely grouped into two categories. One are strikes by non-union workers affiliated with ongoing campaigns. This is fast food. This is pre-recognition Starbucks strikes. And I think a big reason you saw a decrease in the number of non-union strikes, or I should say the percentage of strikes that were non-union or led by non-union workers, is because almost every Starbucks strike in 2023 were organized by, workers who already won formal union recognition. In 2022, a majority were, but there was a sizable amount of sort of pre-recognition Starbucks strikes, and that certainly shifted into 2023. But then the other category are sort of non-union workers who more or less spontaneously walk off the job in response to an immediate workplace issue, usually without, never mind any union affiliation, but organizational affiliation. So we documented, several strikes last summer, for example, in response to broken AC units, right? So these are spontaneous walkouts in response to immediate health and safety issues. Whether those walkouts lead to more sustainable organization, we don't have data on that. But I do think those are the two types of strikes you see. Strikes by non-union workers affiliated with existing campaigns. I would say the fast food campaign being the best example now at that. And strikes by non-union workers largely spontaneous in response to immediate workplace issues.
Can you quantify that breakout?
Unfortunately, and great question. Unfortunately, we can't now. But Seth, you've given me something else to work for in the 2024 report, so we'll see what I can do next year.
I'm telling you, I'm a font of unanswerable questions. What can I say? So let me shine a light on workers' demands, because there are, as you just were saying, strikes happen for a reason. There are things that workers want. They might want an AC unit. They might want a pension. They might want a safer workplace. So pay and health and safety top the list in 2023 as they did in 2022. But staffing rose to third place in 2023. That's not a surprise to me, because healthcare strikes were more prominent, particularly the coalition strike, but there were others as well. There was more strike activity in healthcare, as you pointed out. Do you think the issue of inadequate staffing is just a healthcare issue, or were you seeing that in strikes in other industries as well?
So it's certainly, just to reiterate a point you just made, a huge issue in healthcare. Staffing concerns have long been a major demand of strikes, especially by those state level nurses associations you talked about, but really healthcare unions more broadly. And it absolutely played a huge role in strikes in 2023. That being said, I absolutely think this is a broader service sector or customer facing industry phenomenon, I should say. So just as an example, well over 1/3 of all Starbucks strikes in 2023 involve staffing as a main demand. So this is not just a story about healthcare. This is a story about, I'm sure part of it relates to the tight labor market, but understaffing at many customer facing industries. And you see a lot of, I would say, accommodation and food services is really up there as well. You just see a lot of strikes in which staffing is a major demand in those industries. So it's certainly broader than healthcare. And if you look at the Starbucks campaign and some of the reasons, not just why they're striking, but they're organizing and they're negotiating contract, it's because of issues related to understaffing. That's been a persistent issue since that campaign began in late 2021.
Yeah. Back when I used to be a Starbucks customer, I experienced it. And I think we all experience it, as these poor baristas are working as fast as they possibly can on machines that are not designed to go quickly. And there's lines of people, and they don't have the opportunity to clean the place up, and they're scrambling. They're endlessly scrambling. And that is all profit maximization by Starbucks. That's this portraying themselves as this humane employer is anybody who's been in a Starbucks knows that that's not the case. All right, I threatened you with this question, and now I'm going to actually ask it. So we're going to look to the future, and I'm going to make you go on the record. I'm going to make you go on the record with some predictions. So, as you mentioned, there are there are many collective bargaining rounds involving fairly large units of workers, Boeing and the machinists, the East and Gulf Coast ports and the ILA, the Hollywood studios and the two other unions that I mentioned, the musicians and the Yahtzee, AT&T and CWA, several large city school districts are going to have negotiations this year, and there are many, many others. And of course, I'm not going to ask you to predict which of those negotiations are going to turn into strikes. I hope you don't know that. I don't know that. My expectation is the parties don't know that yet either. But I want your best guess here. When we bring you back in February 2025, and I recycle all of the questions that I just asked you, and that new one that I just put on your plate, where do you think these numbers are going to be? Is 2023 going to end up looking like an anomalous year because we had these 4 big strikes? Is it going to look like the middle of a trend? Is it going to look like the beginning of an even bigger trend? Will we be higher, lower, or somewhere in between?
Of course, need to give my disclaimer. I'm notoriously bad at predictions, and we'll see how this goes a year from now. But look, I think the point we made earlier that you did have a lot of I understand the point you just made, Seth, about there are a lot of bargaining units that have contract expirations this upcoming year. I don't think it quite matches the size of the bargaining units that had contracts
That's right.
expiring last year. And I think when you're looking at the number of workers involved, that's a huge determinant. So I would predict that the level of number of strikes or work stoppages will be pretty similar. This has actually been quite constant since Striketober in 2021. So you had a much lower level of strike activity early in 2021. It picked up late, continued into 2022. There was an increase in 2023, but you're in the ballpark of the mid 400s. So once again, hard to predict. I think we're going to probably be around that same ballpark in 2024. I would guess that the number of workers on strike in 2024 will be somewhere in between 2022 and 2023. That's a big number. That's a gap of about 300,000. So, not exactly going out on a limb there. But I do think you're seeing more militancy, more activism in general. You're in a presidential year. Maybe you would probably have better insight into me how that would play in terms of unions negotiating positions and whether they would want to go on strike in the middle of a presidential year, especially some of the more high profile strikes that could have political implications. So that's obviously a question mark. But I would say probably somewhere in between the 2022 and 2023 numbers. The only other thing I'll add is it is difficult to, another prediction I'll make is another doubling of the number of first contract strikes, right? So we went from about 35 to about 70, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get into 140 sounds like a lot, but into the triple digits with the number of first contract strikes, because it's not just Starbucks and Trader Joe's, as you know, Seth, and I think you did a really fabulous blog post on this, blogcast, excuse me. It's higher ed. There's been a lot of very large new units organized in higher ed. I can speak from the experience at Cornell. There was a big difference in how the administration approached the union effort in 2017 than this past year in 2023. That may continue to the bargaining table. We'll see. But you could certainly potentially, even in 2024, see some first contract strikes related to higher ed. And those are larger bargaining units. So I'll make that other prediction as well on the first contract strikes. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts as well on this question.
I'm going to echo your point on higher education. It's interesting. A lot of the strikes that we've seen in higher education have been at public institutions, not at private institutions. Rutgers, Cal State, University of California back in 2022. Some of the very, very large strikes we see in educational services or in higher education absolutely are because state law makes it somewhat easier for workers to be able to protect themselves if they go out on strike. Also, it makes organizing significantly easier than it does in the private sector. But you're right, there are units being organized all over the country, on campuses all over the country, of all different kinds of workers. You have the UAW organizing contract faculty at NYU. You have undergraduate students at Dartmouth. You have graduate workers at my home institution and others that are being organized. There are some schools that aren't afraid to take the reputational hit and go to war, frankly, with their students, student workers. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think that could drive the numbers up some, but as you said, it's unlikely that any of them are going to match the size of the UAW strike or the Hollywood strikes, just for impact, for volume. I just think it's going to be very, 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 very hard. Okay, I'm going to give you a chance to predict what is the biggest surprise that we're going to see in next year's report. You've already told us that you think we're going to see first contract strikes go up. What would be the biggest surprise in addition to that, if there are any? Maybe we're not going to see any surprises because you've done such a great job educating us about what's happening in this part of the world.
I should have saved my first contract point to answer this question. That's probably my biggest surprise prediction. I think I'll do a classic academic trick of pivoting my response to that question to talk a little bit about something I mentioned earlier, whether this is a surprise or not. I think the ultimate test and what we're really all confronting as whether you're a labor movement activist, whether you're in the policy realm, whether you're in the scholarship realm, are we in a transformative moment? Is this a flash in the pan? Where exactly are we as we head into 2024? And I do think, once again, a huge case and study is going to be these UAW campaigns in terms of examining the relationship between strikes by unionized workers and creating a more sustainable moment, a more transformation in the labor movement more broadly, and to see if the UAW is really going to be able to go out and organize these non-union plants that they've had such a difficulty organizing for so long. That to me is sort of the biggest question and potentially the biggest surprise if they're able to have some success. Obviously, they're up against really difficult legal and other obstacles. But I would, once again, it's not really surprised. That's really where my head's at right now, is what's that relationship between striking, especially by union members, and the broader labor movement. To me, the UAW is the clearest case. This isn't to ignore. Obviously, we already mentioned higher ed. A lot of the activism is happening in the service sector. You have these ongoing first contract fights also at Starbucks, Trader Joe's, Amazon. But I really look at that, relationship between strikes and organizing to see how that'll play out, because I think this is the moment, this is the year. If we're going to, I think by this time next year, we're really going to be able to have a strong answer one way or the other to that question, were we in a transformative moment or not?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. It'll be very interesting to see whether the UAW can essentially cash in its chips from the Big Three negotiations in organizing successes. I will offer this as a prediction of a surprise that we will see in next year's report. Because of the way that unions like SEIU are changing the model of organizing. So you have organizations like the Union of Southern Service Workers, the Fast Food Workers Union in California, and others like them in various industries, where the traditional model of you organize people, you have an election or you seek recognition, and then you sit down and bargain is not really the way it's going to work, more likely than not. It's possible that it works that way in fast food, but I think it's much more likely that what we will see is varying forms of direct action trying to address particular sets of issues combined with legislative action to get things like the Fast Food Council, sort of a sectoral bargaining approach, what happened with the nail salon workers in New York, the efforts that are going on in the gig economy. If I'm right about that, I think we will see more smaller strikes that are short duration, as you were describing before, that will be workers trying to address particular demands in particular places as a tool towards ultimately organizing a union. I think 2023 was not the beginning of that strategy, but sort of the maturation of that strategy. And now I think it's going to play out in 2024 in a very, very, very big way. And I'll just make one comment about your point about whether the presidential election is going to affect the number of strikes and negotiations. My prediction is not at all. I think that union leaders are much more concerned what their members think than what President Biden thinks. They care about President Biden and they want to see him reelected. But when push comes to shove, their members need a good quality contract, and they're going to do what's necessary in order to win. That's my sense from talking to union leaders and others. Dr. Johnnie Kallas, can't thank you enough. I think you better, here's a piece of advice I'll offer, because it's a prediction. It's a prediction wrapped in the piece of advice. You need to go to the admissions people at the University of Illinois School of Labor and Employment Relations and say that they should get ready for a huge influx of new applicants, of students who want to study with Dr. Johnnie Kallas. Because this research that you've done is so valuable, so important, and you did such a terrific job explaining it. I really appreciate you, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about it again soon.
Absolutely. Appreciate you, Seth, and look forward to chatting again next year, if not before that.
Great. Thanks, Johnny. Hey, thanks for sticking with us to the end of this blogcast. I learned a lot during that conversation. You could probably tell. I was learning as we went. I hope you learned a lot and enjoyed it and got some insight into worker power and strikes and collective actions in the United States in 2023 and 2024. Grateful that you stick with us through these blogcasts. You can also connect with us. Connect with the Power at Work blog team on social media. We have pages on LinkedIn and Facebook. just search Power at Work Blog. You can find us at Power at Work Blog on Twitter, X, and Threads. You can find us at Power at Work on Instagram, TikTok, and Patreon as well. You can find all of the Power at Work blogcasts on YouTube on the Burns Center for Social Change channel. So go there, take a look, catch up. You can also find them right here on the Power at Work blog. Just click on Blogcasts, you'll find more. The most important thing you can do is to go right now to the front page of the Power at Work blog and subscribe. That way we can keep you up on our latest content, and you will get every week an issue of the weekly download in your inbox, a collection of 24 or so articles, opinion pieces, videos, studies, research about workers, worker power, collective action. It's a great way to keep up with labor news in the United States. Thanks again for joining us for this blogcast. We will see you right back here on the blog very soon.
The Power at Work blog is a project of the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. The Burns Center develops innovative, participatory, and equitable approaches to solving public problems using new technology. Our faculty and fellows are accomplished, nationally recognized changemakers. Interested in learning more? Go to burns.northeastern.edu and sign up for our mailing list. And you can follow us on social media at Burns Center on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. The Burns Center for Social Change, from demanding change to making it.